am going to talk about women's relationships with women, especially in the workplace. And this is something that I got interested in back in about 1977. And I want to tell you why I got interested in it, because I think the context is important. I had been a feminist, or realized I was a feminist, for about 7 or 8 years. And I was noticing that people were saying, oh, women just can't get along with each other, or they're always having cat fights, or they're always competing for a man. And I thought, well, not always. Sometimes these things happen, but sometimes men fight with each other and men compete with each other too. And it just made me very sensitive to the stereotypes about women, about it being just impossible for women to get along. And I thought, if we want to really build a strong women's movement, then it's important to look at what are the things that happen that come between women, or that set women up against each other, so that with that awareness, we can more easily figure out what to do to overcome them. And so I ended up writing my first book, which was called Between Women, Lowering the Barriers. And it was about women in the workplace, it was about women friends, it was about mothers and daughters. And then later, I was asked to write a book specifically about mothers and daughters, and it was called Don't Blame Mother, Mending the Mother-Daughter Relationship. And then about 10 years after that, the publisher asked me to do a 10-year anniversary edition, and she said, I want you to update it. And I read through it, and I called her and I said, this is really upsetting because it's not out of date. The things that set women up against each other and that did it, decades ago, they're still doing it. And so as I thought about had anything changed, it was that, as far as I could tell, in some ways, despite the fact that there's a woman astronaut and a woman this, and there are a few more women in positions that women didn't used to be in, and in occupations and so on. I thought, but in a lot of ways, women's responsibilities and the expectations placed on women have gotten even greater than they were before, because now, and it's still true today, women are supposed to do everything, and instead of just in the 1950s, when at least white middle class women who were mothers were supposed to raise their daughters to be good mothers and wives, and people take care of the house and so on. Now women are expected to do absolutely everything, and to raise children who are girls and children who are boys, to feel that they can do anything. And not much has changed from the standpoint of who is sharing that responsibility. And I also wrote a book called Lifting a Ton of Feathers, and it was about women in academia. And there's a lot of overlap that helps us understand the position of women in academia, and the position of women in any workplace, and the position of women in the home. And that is that there are a lot of myths that coexist. Some of them are mutually exclusive, and I'm going to go through some of those in a few minutes. But the fact is that women, I think, in a way, have a harder time than ever before, because a lot of people think we're in a post-feminist era. Women have total equality in every respect. And so when there is a problem, or when there is clear evidence of inequality, there's kind of surprise, or why are you complaining about this when you've got so much? Some of you may have experienced the fact that in the workplace, there have been some fairly recent, in the last few decades, fairly recent developments that were supposed to make it easier for women to balance work life and home life. Far less emphasis, of course, on men being able to balance those two, because the expectation is still overwhelmingly that women will take care of the kids in the household, and that when men do it, It's a really great thing when they do any of that, and there are data that prove that. So working women, when you get to the workplace, you are likely to be exhausted from all the responsibilities you still have at home. Some research that was done recently showed that, people talk about the new man, and there are some men who really do a great job and do their share, and don't expect to be worshipped because of doing their share. But that overall, if there's a two-parent heterosexual couple and they both have full-time jobs, it's unusual if the man does as much as 1/3 of the household work and childcare. And the kinds of things that he does are more likely to be the kinds of things that get noticed and that you don't have to do every day or every week, like making the food, doing the shopping, cleaning up, dusting, that sort of thing. I is still today much more likely to get the oil changed in the car or to mow the lawn or shovel the snow. And people will say, wow, that was great. Whereas people still don't say, gee, mom, that was a great week's worth of dusting you did. Or that was a delicious and nutritious set of meals you prepared this week. So a lot of the work that women do in the home remains invisible and is certainly unpaid. I have on my Facebook page, I post periodically what I call my another entry in my Sexism Still Thrives series, and oh my gosh, the examples are way too frequent. But just in case anybody isn't quite sure if sexism continues, and as you know, this comes out in all sorts of ways that people think don't happen anymore. You submit an article to a scholarly journal, a law journal, and you sign it Jane Smith, it's less likely to be accepted than if you sign it John Smith, that sort of thing. We know about there's no equal pay. We know that the ERA has not been ratified yet. And in fact, on the 2 years of women's marches, the organizers of the marches did some absolutely wonderful work, but asked the speakers not to mention the Equal Rights Amendment, which I thought was shocking and deeply troubling, because at least some of you are lawyers, if not all of you, and you know about strict scrutiny and constitutional law as opposed to the kind of piecemeal laws that we have. So women are natural allies in a lot of ways. Women are more likely to be socialized, to be skilled at and aware of relationships, how to fix them, how to say things tactfully, and so on. And it's still considered more likely to be a thing that's appropriate for women to learn how to do, to develop skills at doing, than for men. And so when you put together two people who've both been socialized that way, you would think, well, then they should be able to get along really beautifully. They can talk about what's really happening, what are you each feeling, how can we solve these problems? But as long as we live in a sexist society, anything that can be used against women will be used against women. Just as long as we live in a racist society, anything that can be used against anyone who's not white will be against them. And that takes us to the myths. And when we go through these myths, none of them are going to surprise you, but I want you to keep a couple of things in mind. These are myths that pervade our society even today. And you may think, no, because women are considered equal. But all of the surveys, all of the studies that have been done show that these myths continue to be pervasive. And keep in mind, please, that they coexist, that we all tend to absorb them by osmosis, the whole society does, and we try to operate, whether in the workplace or at home, under the weight of all of these myths. And in the image that always comes to my mind when people talk about women can't get along, say, in the workplace. I think, if you have a group of people who have fewer resources or get lower pay or less respect or whatever than another group, then what tends to happen is that they're like mice in a cage that's too small for them. And so they may well start picking at each other and nudging each other and fighting for space instead of saying, hey, who put us in this cage? What does this cage consist of? And how can we help each other get out? That too often happens when the resources are few, when the level of respect is low. And also, before I start talking about some of the specific myths, I want to point out that in any kind of society or organization, the people who have the most power don't often have much interest in actually sharing their power. And so, for those people who want to maintain their power, they have to be afraid. What if the people beneath me do something that seems good, seems admirable? It's going to make it harder for me to blame them for anything that goes wrong. And goodness knows, if I want to keep my power, I need a scapegoated individual or a scapegoated group. And so I have to implement or help perpetuate all of these myths, each of which in its own way contributes, if we're not careful, to setting women up against each other. Now, I'm living in a place that's sort of temporary right now, so I don't have my original book, between women book, with me, but I have the first edition of Don't Blame Mother, and the myths about mothers are very similar to the myths about women. And that's because every woman is at some level, consciously or unconsciously, regarded as, well, this either is a mother or is potentially a mother. Or if she says she doesn't want to have children, or if she wants to but can't have children, then we have expectations that she will be like we think mothers ought to be because she's a woman. And one of the things I wrote about in the book about women in academia, it certainly applies in other workplaces, is that some of that there are catch-22s. And a catch-22 is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But then I discovered there are also things that I ended up calling catch-33s, for want of a better term, because sometimes there are three options and you're damned either way. And in other words, the myths exist and mutually exclusive ones coexist because the people with greater power need them to be present in order for them to continue to keep some group scapegoated, to keep them in at least a one down position. So the good woman myths, or the good mother myths, or however you want to say it, there are four of these, and as I say, none of them will surprise you. One is the measure of a good woman is a perfect woman, or that she does perfect work. Women, the second one, women are endless founts of nurturance, and I want to come back to that one in a minute. Women, mothers, naturally know how to raise children. And then when you apply this to women more broadly, this myth, it's women naturally know how to take care of relationships in general, whether in the workplace or outside the workplace. And the fourth of these first myths are that women don't get angry. A good woman doesn't get angry. Now, these four myths are what I call the perfect woman myths. These are the ones that every woman is expected to match up to. And if she doesn't, she's considered, well, all sorts of terrible things, at least unwomanly, unfeminine, and that's supposed to be bad, sort of strange, probably angry, probably selfish. mentally ill, however you define that. And I want to come back for a minute to the one about women are endless founts of nurturance. There was the case, I'm a psychologist, and I was consulting with a lawyer on an appeal that he was preparing. It was a child custody dispute in a state in New England. And there was a married heterosexual couple. They had two kids, and they split up. The father had no interest in having custody of the kids or having them with them very often. And so the mother was given custody, and she wanted to homeschool the kids. And one of the kids had a learning disability, and she did the best she could, and she was very bright. And when the school board people came out to see if the kids were learning all they should, they said that this one kid needed some additional help. And she was prepared to provide that. Well, in the meantime, the father had acquired a girlfriend and decided he wanted custody of the kids. There was a custody dispute. A psychologist was brought in, and I have to tell you, lots of times I'm ashamed to tell people I'm a psychologist because of what some people in my field do, psychologists, psychiatrists. When they're asked to do a psych evaluation, some of the and judges want to believe that these therapists are finding the truth, because judges don't hate making these decisions in these child custody disputes. So they go psych eval, and then they often, as one of my students documented for her thesis, they often just rubber stamp what the psychologist does. So the psychologist in this case decided that the father should have custody of the kids because the fact that the mother was homeschooling them, and there'd never been any question about her ability as a mother or her relationships with the kids. It was all, she was like a textbook good mother. But the psychologist said the fact that she was homeschooling them showed that she was unnaturally close to the kids. So they should go live with the father. Now, I said to the lawyer who was preparing the appeal, and he did not use this, and I'm not sure why. I said, I think there's sex discrimination going on here because the father, when he is spending time with the kids, and again, research has documented all of this, he is more likely to be deemed a wonderful, loving father. Whereas a mother, if there's any question about what she's doing, here she is because she cares about the kids. She wants to make sure that she can teach them and she can keep an eye on how they're doing. And whatever you feel about homeschooling, the point here is that that therapists are very quick, and I did research documenting empirically all the mother blame that goes on in the mental health system. That mothers who are caring and loving are vastly, statistically more likely to be considered bad mothers because they're too close, they're smothering, they are in symbiotic relationships with the kids, when a father who does exactly the same thing is more likely to be deemed a good father. So these myths can be turned on her. Mothers are supposed to be nurturant, but then when she's being nurturant and really caring about the kids, then that is pathologized. So that's an example of one of the catch-22s. Then there are the bad woman myths. Now, these are myths that, and by the way, the perfect woman myths, all four of those, they set standards that are so high that no human being could ever meet them. So the existence and the pervasiveness of these myths it's really dangerous to women because it means that we absorb them too. So if we get angry, oh my God, I'm not supposed to do that. He got angry, but then I'm a woman. I'm supposed to be calmer. I'm supposed to be more peace loving. I'm supposed to find ways to be sweet all the time. And you may have heard, I did a lot of research on this when the Prozac patent was about to expire. Lily was worried because that was going to mean a loss of a lot of money for them. But if they could find another condition besides depression and get the FDA to approve the use of Prozac for that, and they get an extension on the patent, and that's worth millions or billions of dollars. So two psychiatrists, it was two men, and I swear to God, on a fishing trip, made up premenstrual dysphoric disorder. which is code for women go crazy once a month. Now, there is no evidence, that women's moods get worse on a cyclical basis than men's. That has been documented. Gloria Steinem's written about this, actually. That has been documented in research. But they got this label into the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, and then Eli Lilly started producing, it was Prozac. All the ingredients were the same, but instead of green and white, it was pink and purple. And they renamed it Sarafem. And they had commercials. You may have seen them with, for example, a woman at a grocery store trying to get a grocery cart unstuck from the other grocery carts, and you know how that happens. But she looked like she was going to go completely insane. This over said, "You may think you have PMS, but you really have PMDD. It's a mental illness. You need Sarafem." Every woman who was ashamed of herself for ever getting upset or angry went running to, not every woman, lots of women went running to their GYNs or their family doctors or a therapist and said, I've got to take Sarafem because I'm not a nice person once a month. I've written a whole lot about that, and I know there are arguments people put up against this, and I have addressed these if anybody's interested. But the point is that there is this double standard, and when we get to the bad woman myths, these are myths that, again, imagine it's the people who have the power, who don't want to share it, who really make use of these myths in various ways. The bad woman, I'm sorry, did somebody say something? Oh, I heard a noise. I thought somebody was had a question. The bad mother myths are myths that allow us to take something bad that a woman does, because we're not perfect, of course, and so sometimes we do bad things, or something neutral, or even something good, and transform it into further proof that the woman is bad, or that women in general are bad. And let me read through these real quickly. Women are inferior to men. Women need experts' advice to learn how to do just about anything, including dealing with relationships, which, remember, in the good woman myths, one of them was women naturally know how to deal with relationships. So this is an example of two myths that are exclusive, that coexist. And then this one is women are bottomless pits of emotional neediness. A quick example of these, how that one played out. A woman that I knew was an only child. Her parents got very old. They both had Alzheimer's. They were in separate nursing homes. She said to me, when she was hearing about these myths, she said, "Oh my God, I just realized, when I go to see my father and he wants to talk, and if he opens up at all, I feel like I got a medal. Daddy wants to talk and he trusts me. When I go to see my mother, if she wants to talk, my reaction is, oh my God, if I let her get started, she'll never stop." There's the women are bottomless pits of neediness. And that is a mutually exclusive myth with the good woman myth that women are endless founts of nurturance. Now, on basic physics principles, you can't be giving and giving all the time, this force going this way out from you, and taking and taking and taking all the time. So you see, there is a myth for every occasion. Anything a woman does can easily be transformed into proof that she's bad. The last two are the closeness between women is unhealthy. Certainly mother-daughter closeness, although some people say, oh no, mothers and daughters, it's great, they're always close. But then when they are close, there are a lot of people that will say, oh, they're enmeshed. They have a symbiotic relationship. And I was once on a radio show with a woman interviewer, and she said to me, she'd read the book, and she said, that one about mother-daughter closeness? She said, I have to tell you something. I talk to my mother every day. And I said, oh, does it not go well? It's great. We laugh a lot. And I said, well, then why did you talk to her every day? Her embarrassed. And she said, well, I know it means that we're too close and we haven't individuated and I'm still tied to her apron strings. And I said, do you have a partner? Yeah, she was with a guy. Do you talk to him every day? Yeah. Are you embarrassed? No, of course not. So what I keep finding is you bring a woman into any relationship at work or in the home, and it's likely to be pathologized. And I've written a couple of books about that. And the last one is women are dangerous when they're powerful. I once went to a university to talk about my book about women in academia, and the women's studies program had brought me there, and they said, you know, the guy who's head of the business school here wants to talk to you. We loaned him your book, and he wants to talk to you, and we're not sure why. And I said, okay, look, I'll go talk to him. And so ushered into his big fancy office, and he's got the book there, and it's highlighted all the way through. He'd really read it. And he said to me, he said, you know what? Oh, and sorry, and the women's studies people had said, this guy is so sexist. It's like he's crawled out from under a rock. I mean, I don't know what he's going to say to you. But what he said to me was, you know that thing about women are dangerous when they're powerful? He said, you're so right. I realized I do believe that. Like if two of my graduate students who are men say, we'd like to come and talk to you together, I think, oh, well, I wonder what they want to talk about. But if two women students say, we'd like to come and talk to you together, I think, uh-oh, what is... So this default suspicion of two women getting together. Now, have to develop some degree of trust because when the resources are few for women, and of course, I mean, everything I'm saying about women um, could apply when some of the myths, the content of the myths will be different um, if we're looking at race, or if we're looking at people with disabilities, or if we're looking at people who are considered old to be in the workplace, or whatever, and certainly with respect to class. But very often, if the resources are scarce for your group or groups that you're identified as being part of, it takes a while, and you have to start small, and also go cut across class lines. So, for example, when I was in Toronto. I was working in the family court clinic. There were the psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and then there was the secretarial staff. And nobody who was a clinician ever went to lunch with one of the secretaries. It just wasn't done. Well, I started going to lunch with one of the secretaries, and I found out that the way in which our male team leader was mistreating the at least me in our private supervision session, I thought, well, actually, what was wrong with me? You know, he doesn't like me. What am I not doing right? He tells me I'm not doing what a psychologist is supposed to do, even though I think I am. She started talking about the way he treated her and the way he'd seen him treat other women. And so that was really important, because a big step forward is coming to understand that a problem that women especially are socialized to blame ourselves when anything goes wrong. And that, again, even today, that keeps being supported in research, that's still the pattern. And so instead of thinking, what did I do wrong? I mean, there's nothing wrong with asking yourself that and really looking honestly, but also, at the very least, also think systemically. Here might be being mistreated, undervalued, underpaid, as I am, and then try to get to know them a little bit, and then you can start talking about how these myths are played out in your workplace. And you know, sometimes it's just getting more information that you're not the only one. That after I had lunch with that one secretary, the next time I went for a supervision session with this guy, I realized that he would start humiliating me as he did every week. And I found that physically, I was leaning forward. I was pulling my arms in front of my chest, and my knees were together, and I was making myself as small as I could, as you tend to do when you feel powerless. And when I caught myself doing that and I remembered what the secretary said, I consciously decided that the next week I was going to take up as much physical space as possible. And it transformed my interactions with him. I don't think he knew what hit him, but I wore slacks. I crossed one ankle over the other knee. And in what felt like a declaration of war, in a way, I leaned back and I clasped my hands behind my head and my elbows down to the side. And, you know, he went to the head of the clinic and said he thought we had a personality conflict and I should be switched. Um, I don't know if that doesn't fully answer your question, but these are the kinds of things I would start with. Get to know people, and as you develop trust, you know, just bring up tentatively one of the myths and how you see it being played out, and have they noticed it? And so, as I say, so sometimes just being aware that it's a systemic problem or it's a problem in your office is enough to empower each of the two of you or the group of you to not stand for it or to see what's happening more clearly instead of seeing it through the sort of colander or whatever of all of these myths that distort what's really happening. Yeah, it can be very tricky because it always depends on the degree to which you are vulnerable and what resources you have available to you. And so it's just like when graduate students used to say, I want to write a doctoral dissertation that's it's a very radically feminist dissertation, but I'm afraid my committee won't approve it. I say, well, then don't. When you're in this powerless a position, don't take the biggest risk you could possibly take. But when you are in a very vulnerable position, again, at the risk of sounding, too repetitious, start by looking at the myths yourself. You'll be amazed how it can change your whole way of understanding what's happening. And then it will take time to find out whom you can trust. It's great for this reason if people who are in a minority or in a relatively worse treated position in a law firm or in a particular workplace, if they're assigned a mentor who comes from the same groupings that they come from, because then presumably the mentor will have gone through similar things, will be more easily able to understand what it is that you're going through and advise you on how that can be dealt with, or if it can be grappled with in your workplace. And I want to mention in this connection one other thing, which is the queen bee image, the stereotype. And women are more likely to say that women are harder to work with than men are. But again, if you realize what the expectations are that the woman supervisor or the woman CEO or whatever, or woman partner will be constantly nurturant and supportive and that sort of thing, then of course your perception is going to be that, oh my God, women are just impossible. Or if it's a woman who gets angry and she's not supposed to, in contrast to a man in a similar position who gets angry. So that's how these myths can be played out. But I have to tell you about these queen bees, or people who are perceived that way. Often you realize that if they're the queen bee, imagine what they had to go through to get there. And imagine, I mean, the psychologists who started having lunch with the secretaries, people were talking about us. What's wrong with them? We were sort of considered second class because of that, or because of certain issues that we brought up that weren't considered part of the clinic's mandate, but that seemed to us to be what we should be doing for our clients, regardless of what the traditional approaches were. And so I was asked to give a keynote address to a group of very highly placed women in academic environments in Canada one year. And they loved what I said in the keynote address. I was talking about stereotypes about women working together, about much of the same thing we've been talking about. Oh, they absolutely loved it. then later I was supposed to come back and talk about, well, so what could they do about the difficulties they were having? Because I went to the whole conference and these women were talking about feeling left out, feeling shut out, even though they had very high positions in academic administrations. They were still being treated badly. And Sandra Pike, who's a Canadian psychologist, said, well, yeah, because women are too often in the A positions. They're the assistant this, the associate this, the acting whatever, instead of the top people. And so if you have a position lower in status and power than that woman has, then there's a tendency to think that that woman can do anything she wants. So why is she not doing everything that you think she should be doing? And you don't really grasp that they have less power than the people who can fire them or can make their lives miserable. So one of the things I suggested when we had the session about, so what can women do? I mean, these women were weeping. They were, they felt so isolated and miserable and mistreated. And I said, how about this? And I suggested that on their campuses that they do surveys of how people were treated, and if they were treated differentially based on their sex, based on their race, ethnicity, and so on, and publish the data, and then have recommendations about what needs to be done to make things better on that campus. The women became enraged at me because they felt I failed to appreciate how vulnerable positions they were in. They knew they'd out so fast if they tried to do that kind of thing. So sometimes somebody who looks like they have a lot of power, they really don't. One other quick example, I was asked to be the head of the Women's Center at the Faculty of Education of the University of Toronto, and I was asked to do it because nobody else wanted to do it. And I was the target of enormous rage because people in the Women's Center a lot of them were associate professors, assistant professors, lecturers, not the full professors, and they wanted more research money. They wanted more space to meet with their graduate students and have interesting discussions. They wanted all sorts of things. And they came to me because, after all, I was head of the Women's Center. And I couldn't give that to them because the top administration wouldn't give us more than one little tiny office, give us money to work with, wouldn't let us hire somebody part-time. And yet, because I was in a more powerful position than they were, they thought that I could do it if I really wanted to. And so that's sort of painful. I mean, that's the mice in a cage, right?
Thank you so much.
Any time, the Me Too movement is, I'm 70 years old, so I remember the beginning of the second wave, the women's movement back in the late 60s and early 70s. And at that time, there were consciousness raising when women would get together, and that was how each individual woman started to discover that, for example, if she was a stay-at-home mother, she was not the only one who was bored out of her mind. Or if she also worked for pay, she was not the only one who was exhausted all the time. Or if her partner abused her, lots of other women were being treated the same way. That's how all the information about how many women who'd had abortions started to come out, how many women had been sexually abused as children. So that's why the first step is always talking to each other. And you start with one person, then you can have a group. Now, the Me Too movement is very much like that. However, what has invariably happened, anytime women have spoken up and become more powerful because of speaking the truth, what tends to happen, just as is happening with the Me Too movement, is that at first everybody says, well, the women who've been through it say, oh my God, I thought it was just me. And I'm so glad to have the support and the truth spoken by other women as well. and there is strength in that. There's a lot of strength, but then you get a backlash. Susan Faludi wrote a book, I think it was called Backlash, I can't remember, and it was about the backlash against the second wave women's movement, because this takes us right back to what I started with. The people who have the power. You think Harvey Weinstein wanted to be turfed out? No. Do you think any of these people who are losing their power want to be? No. And there are a lot of people, mostly men, but some women too, who have been abusive in various ways to their employees and or their coworkers, and they don't want to be found out. And so you'll hear them say, the backlash goes from fairly mild things like, well, what, I'm not allowed to say she looks pretty today, to something as really vicious as, well, look at all these awful women getting these men fired, and where's the due process? And I know lawyers care about due process, and I do too. But do you think for a minute that NBC would have fired Matt Lauer? All the viewers he brings in and all the money and all of his history with NBC, if there wasn't pretty persuasive evidence. Now, I know he didn't have a trial, but then he wasn't criminally charged either. So, as you know, criminal charges are not the only way to deal with problems, but be careful about watching for the backlash and to support each other. And it's really important that the people who start to speak up not just fold when they're accused. And that's why the continuing mutual support groups are so important. And that's why the Time's Up, the legal fund, that's paying for not just women in Hollywood, but mostly for women in lower paying jobs where they have much less power, to pay them to try to get redress for what they went through. That's why that's so important. But what I also want to say, I want to come back to the ERA, and then I know we have to stop and move on. The Equal Rights Amendment is so important to so much of what's going on now, because coming forward about having been sexually harassed and sexually assaulted, it's mostly women. It's some men too, but it's mostly women. Now, they can file under Title IX if it was on a campus. They can file under Title what's the one sex discrimination workplace? 6? Yeah. 7. Thank you. But the problem is, and I learned this from lawyers, that and also from watching what Congress is doing now and what the executive branch is doing now, that you can have these various pieces of legislation that are not part of the Constitution, and they can be abolished, or they can be defanged by executive order. Look what's happened with Congress and the Voting Rights Act. And so that's why we need the ERA, because we need stricter scrutiny. And we really need to have it in the Constitution, and not this piecemeal kind of thing. My daughter is an attorney who does EEO work, and has worked for the federal government for a long time. And so she's not allowed to tell me